All right, everybody, welcome to podcast 5. And in this podcast, we are going to very quickly just cover different kinds of ways in which you can describe a community. We've been talking about various aspects of communities, and this is going to be pretty straightforward. Just how can we talk about them? What are they like? How can we describe them? Please remember, as we've already stated, that a community, when we study the community level in ecology, we're talking about who are all the different species that exist in a community, and how do they interact with each other. Okay, so interspecific interactions. How does a wolf interact with a rabbit, interact with a clover plant, things like that. Okay, now there are several ways to talk about a community or describe it. We can talk about a community in terms of how diverse it is, how many different types of species exist in the community. Is it very biodiverse? In fact, that's a good word to associate with communities, is biodiversity. How diverse, how many different species are there? Let's see, next. In keeping with that idea, what are the most numerous or abundant species in your community? How many grass plants? How many squirrels? How many oak trees? Things like that. We can talk about this in terms of biomass. We actually, kind of touched on this when we talked about ecological pyramids. Biomass, the sheer mass of the different species you have. Numbers, we can talk about the sheer number of different species, organisms that make up those species, and so on. We can talk about, are there particularly important species within a community that if they weren't there, it would have a really dramatic effect on the community. Such species are known as keystone species. They're species that have a really important impact on the community, a bigger impact than you would think given the number of them that are in the community. It seems disproportionate to the number that are present in the community. We can also talk about what stage of succession, what stage of ecological succession the community is in. Ecological succession is an idea that looks at how is this community changing over time? For example, around here in Chesterfield County, we live in a deciduous forest type of community. We are used to seeing oak trees and maple trees and deer and rabbits and squirrels and things like that. But this community didn't just poof here out of thin air. At some point in the history of Earth, this wasn't here. At some point in the history of Earth, in fact, it was barren rock. What stages led to this community we have here? The changes in the type of community you have as over time. It is important that we do not confuse succession with the kinds of change we're talking about when we talk about evolution. They are not the same. Succession and evolution are different, and we'll talk about that as we talk more about succession shortly. Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit more about species diversity. The more diverse your community is, the more stable it is. If we look at 3 communities as they're represented in these little charts, we see that this one is very diverse, whereas this is not very diverse. If we were to lose this plant out of this community, this species, for whatever reason, a disease wiped it out, there's so many other photosynthesizers, primary producers in the community. Likely these herbivores are not going to starve. They're going to be able to survive. But if we lose this guy out of this community, these guys have nothing else to eat, and so we're going to see a collapse in this community if we lose this one guy. So more diversity tends to mean that your community is more stable. You have more food resources for the organisms in that community, more different types of habitat to give shelter and so on, and more chance for bouncing back in case of environmental change, resilience. The community is resilient, more resilient to types of environmental change that might affect it. If you have lots of different species, then some of those different species are probably going to be able to survive the environmental change, even if some of them do not. All right. So what happens when we reduce biodiversity? We can think of it in extreme terms. If we compare these two communities, this one and this one is clearly an agricultural crop. It looks like perhaps it's corn coming up. This would be called quite literally a monoculture. There's one kind of plant growing here, and that's it. This over here is an old field community, probably an old farm field that's been allowed to go back to nature, and so nature has taken its course, and we can see that it obviously looks very different. If a disease were to infect one of these corn plants, it would very likely infect all of them because they're all the same. There's no different species here. Whereas over here we can see there's some purple blooms on these flowers. There's some white blooms, so that's clearly a different type of plant species. There's shrubs, there's trees, there's all kinds of different creatures here, all kinds of different food sources, different types of habitat that are available, and so on. This is going to be much more stable in the face of environmental change. If this one purple flowered plant gets wiped out, there's still many other types of plants to kind of fill in the void, hoping that perhaps they'll make a comeback someday. There's all kinds of food sources, habitats available, and so on. If you think about it, we can also think, clearly this is a man-made situation, intentional monoculture for farming and crops and so on. But this can relate to another concept called the concept of invasive species. An invasive species is an organism that exists in a place, but it's not supposed to. It's not native. There are many organisms that are native to Chesterfield County. They have always been here, whereas there are some species, like, I don't know if you've ever seen kudzu, but this is vine that just grows in enormous amounts up in trees. It's not supposed to be here. It's actually Asian, but it was brought here several years ago, and it really just takes over. It has no natural things that eat it around here very much. It takes over environments. It doesn't have any really things that compete very well with it, and it really just becomes kind of almost a monoculture where this type of plant is. If we think in terms of sorry. Okay. This scenario, if there's a very common plant called Phragmites, and I'll spell it for you. Phragmites is an invasive species. It's a reed. It's generally found in aquatic places, but for example, let's just plop it in here. If Phragmites, an invasive species, takes root, it just outcompetes everything in its path. And so this field in my red pen here is Phragmites coming in and taking over. It outcompetes all the grasses and so on in this open field. So if that were the case, we are reducing the kinds of foods that are available to the species in this community, the types of shelter, and the biodiversity is going to go down in more than just the plants. Invasive species, generally speaking, are pretty dangerous things. They turn your nice, diverse, very resilient community into a monoculture that is very vulnerable to disease and so on, and reduces the kinds of resources available to support other diverse populations. Okay. All right, keystone species. As we said, a keystone species is a species that has a really important effect on a community, even though its numbers may not be so great. The sea otter is considered to be a keystone species in the Pacific Northwest. There are kelp forests in the Pacific Northwest. Sea urchins feed on the kelp. and sea otters feed on the sea urchins. And as long as there's plenty of sea otters to eat sea urchins, then they don't go crazy and eat up all the kelp, and so the kelp forest is a nice diverse habitat for lots and lots and lots of other creatures. However, as populations of killer whales began to rise after we kind of controlled fishing practices and so on, they feed on sea otters, so the sea otter population went down. And as a result, the sea urchin population went up, which totally crushed the kelp forest population, which in turn impacted the entire kelp forest community. So once sea otters were protected from hunting by humans and so on, their population went back up. The sea urchin population came back down, and our kelp forest could rebound after that. So the sea otters are considered a keystone species. And I believe these blocks are just kind of keystone predator in Pacific North. The impact of the whale obviously was to reduce sea otter numbers, and that had a terrible effect on the kelp forest community as a whole. Another important keystone species that's easy to talk about is a beaver. Beavers create entire habitats that did not exist before the beavers come into the picture. This photo is right here showing a beaver dam, which, because they built it, created a beaver pond, which is a completely new habitat. Aside from this river that existed, ponds are very different habitats and support many different organisms that rivers don't, and so the beaver is clearly a keystone species. There may only be a few beaver, but they have an enormous impact on the community by creating the type of habitat that this new community thrives on. Okay, so that is a little bit about communities, and thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next podcast. See you later.